While this is a gross oversimplification, but why not? It seems to me that the teachings of Jesus can fall into sort of two broad categories. On the one hand, you have very practical teaching that tends to be focused on the normal day-to-day stuff, how we get along with one another, how we live in this world. Very simple, practical advice, kind of folk advice in a way. And then on the other hand, you have theological advice, where Jesus is communicating something much more enduring than how we exist and behave in a particular moment, but is communicating a kind of eternal truth. And it seems to me that the place we get into trouble is the place when we confuse those two categories. For instance, this morning, as Jesus talks about how you behave at a dinner party, it could be very easy to think that he's offering practical advice about how a civilized Christian behaves in civilized company, and to treat it as a kind of bit of advice from a mismanners of the first century. But if we do that, we really miss the profound theological point that Jesus is making about us and about our relationship to God. You see, Jesus is pointing at an eternal truth. That as human beings, we have the propensity and desire to claim for ourselves positions of power, prestige, and honor. Jesus looks at the crowd that day, on that occasion, and recognizes this about the human condition, and is wise enough to recognize that it's not just about this particular party, but it's about human beings and the ways that we function. So Jesus uses this opportunity and this illustration of the wedding as a chance to offer a teaching about humility and proper perspective of God, and the perspective we should have about one another. You see, Jesus is trying to communicate that we need to exercise and to practice humility, because only when we are humble, only when we recognize our limitations, only when we recognize that we're human and frail flesh, only then can we relinquish some control and allow God to move us and shape us and direct us into living the way that Jesus modeled. You see, when I'm left to my own devices, I play God. And when I play God, I don't need God. Because I am God. Even though it's a sham, even though it's false, even though it's a lie, I become, for just a little while, God unto myself. And I don't recognize until a situation comes along that I'm really not that much in control, that I'm really not the master of my own destiny, that I'm not the chess master moving pieces around the chessboard. But Jesus is offering an easier way of recognizing this fact. If we'll just accept it and internalize it and exercise trust in God, then we can be free. Free from the sham. Free from the lie. Free to be obedient and to seek the will of God, the God that created us. So this isn't about behaving appropriately in front of others. This is about how we're bound to one another and how we're bound to God and how we might live most fully into those relationships. Because you see, when I'm humble enough to recognize that this isn't all about me all the time and that there's another possibility, then I'm reachable. Then I'm teachable. Then I'm fit and ready and open to receive the grace that's offered me. I think that's what Jesus is talking about as he reminds his host that it would be good to assemble a group that's not all the same. Because I think Jesus recognized that when we're all the same, all from the same background, all with similar resources, all with similar visions, well then we're in a position to sort of reinforce the lie with one another, right? If we all hold the same truths, if we all hold the same beliefs, if we all believe the same mythology, well then we just keep sort of bouncing off one another like pinballs in a pinball machine. And we keep the lie alive. So Jesus says, gather around some have-nots. Gather around those that know they need grace. Gather around those that appear broken, because in them you can recognize your own brokenness. You might remember. Might be like God shaking you a little bit, reminding you that you're a human being and you have everything in common with the person over there that you want to run from like they have the plague. Gather round those that are different, that you might recognize your common humanity, that you might recognize that you're both children of God and beloved. It's funny, as most of you know, I've been out of town for a number of days, about 10 days, dealing with my father's death and the aftermath of that. And it's been a difficult time personally and with family and in all the ways you might imagine. But you have to do all the stuff, right? You have to have a visitation. You have to have a funeral. You have to go through these rituals. And they're good, most of them, because they enable you to begin that process of grief. You don't stop it very quickly, but you begin it through these vehicles of the human condition. And these reminders of the finite nature of life. And they all sort of coalesce in my mind. The 3 days that we did the visitations and the funeral all sort of collapse into one event in my head, as these kinds of things often do. And it was one of the most interesting experiences, I think, of my entire life. You know, I'm always at cocktail parties. I'm always gathering with others at events, and so many times I find myself gathered with the same folk, and we all look the same, we all sound the same, we're all from the same place, more or less, all those sorts of things. But this event for my father was so different in that it wasn't a monolithic crowd at all. There was nothing homogeneous about the crowd that gathered to pay their respects for my father. And I remember standing in line in the hall of the parish the day before his funeral with people sharing experiences that they'd had with my father. Fascinating. And I remember one of the first people in line was a bricklayer that had worked for my grandfather 30 years ago. and had essentially grown up with my father, but continues to this very day to live a life of manual labor, hard manual labor. But this guy is salt and light, the stuff of God. And he talked about how my father had helped him countless times when he really needed some help and had great difficulty finding some help. And then the line moves along. And the next person that comes up to me is let's say a local bank president that said, you know, I've known your father for 50 years. And your father has helped me in some very difficult times. And I just don't know what I would have done had he not been there to help me. And I use those two extremes because they struck me as being so powerful that both of these individuals, from drastically different walks of life, could know and be friends with the same person. And know that they mattered to him. Now, I don't tell this to eulogize my father, although it's tempting. I do it because I think it's what Jesus is talking about in the gospel as he talks about people gathered together. That no matter how different we think we are, we are children of God, and it's there. And that it's a gift to exercise humility in a way that lets us acknowledge it and embrace the other person. It's not a simple practical matter of doing the right thing. It's about embodying the gospel vision that Jesus places before us. It's not about recognizing, thinking about shoulds and coulds. It's about living. It's about living and embodying and becoming the way that Jesus places before us. Give thanks this day that we have a way. Give thanks this day that we have those in our lives that model this for us. Give thanks that it's not just about mere recognition, that it's about life, living, loving, and real.